Well, European countries export an array of goods to the U.S. French wines, Italian fashion, Irish butter. But for Germany, the car industry is king. And that key sector looks set to face a harsh new reality soon.
Global financial markets are tanking again in the wake of U.S. President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs. Stock exchanges across Asia plunged at the start of the new week of trading, with fears growing of a global recession.
And as our domestic agenda cannot be seen separately from global developments around us, let me start with the US tariffs.
Germany, France, and Denmark. Three of Europe's leading countries have created a new wave on the world stage, with moves that have upset the calculations of the US automotive giants. Regulations, ranging from high environmental standards to customs procedures, have suddenly weakened the competitiveness of American vehicles in the European market. The fact that the US automotive industry, which is worth around $1.5 trillion, is facing such a major challenge is not only of concern to automakers or their employees, but also to the general course of the world economy. For many countries, the automotive industry is at the heart of technological innovation, the supply industry, and even diplomatic relations. The picture that is emerging now may bring into question the America First approach that Trump frequently voiced during his presidency.
A new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America First. America First.
In fact, the possibility that the recent moves by Germany, France, and Denmark could significantly reduce American automotive exports or undermine their competitiveness has caused serious confusion in the US administration. Will these developments force the US automotive industry into a radical transformation, or will a new trade war erupt between the two sides? Can American companies, especially those that are late to the next generation of electric models, quickly adapt to the disruptive ecological rules? Or will they lose the European market and suffer a major economic shock? What do you think? Is Europe more right to support tough measures against the climate crisis, or does the US's claim of competition infringement reflect reality? Don't forget to share your comments with us, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications. Here, we take a full look at this new front that is shaking up an industry of enormous size. When we think of the US automotive industry, the first thing that comes to mind is Detroit and the massive production facilities that have grown up around it. Global brands like Ford and General Motors, and long-standing leadership in technology and design. In fact, for a century, the US was considered one of the world's centers of automobile manufacturing, both in terms of volume and innovation. But as time has gone on, Europe's engineering giants, especially Germany, have come to the forefront of automotive technology. German companies have built a reputation for their advanced engine technology, their superiority in the luxury segment, and their impeccable manufacturing. France, on the other hand, has been attracting attention in recent years with its automobile design, and especially its environmentalist approaches. While Denmark, despite being a relatively small economy, has gained a different position with its aggressive policies on green energy and sustainability. Now, it is claimed that these three countries have signed the kind of regulations and political moves that could paralyze America's automotive market. According to some, this development points to a complex picture that cannot be evaluated solely on the basis of economic interests. These are steps to exclude US vehicles because of environmental regulations or standards, some say, while others say, no, this is an outright trade war, a clear example of Europe coming together and putting up barriers to American goods. In the US, the protectionist and nationalist economic policies that Donald Trump has frequently emphasized during his presidency still enjoy support in certain quarters. Trump has repeatedly brought tariffs to the table in trade relations with Europe, complaining that the share of German cars in the American market is too high. For this reason, experts have been right in predicting that sooner or later, European countries will retaliate or toughen up to protect their own interests. It is not yet clear whether these three European countries are acting within the values of the European Union, a huge economic bloc, or imposing their own national policies. Nevertheless, Germany's increased environmental standards and incentives for electric vehicles, France's strengthened support for domestic production and Europe-focused supply chains, and Denmark's strict carbon footprint regulations make it difficult for US manufacturers to compete in the European market. In fact, the large volume, high fuel consumption vehicles traditionally produced by American automotive companies are at a serious disadvantage in the face of Europe's rising environmental discourse. Worse, some argue that American companies seeking to export to these countries may now have to deal with new tax brackets, testing procedures, or compliance certificates. The characterization of Trump as confused is in line with his political style. Trump, who has often used phrases like "the Europeans benefit much more than we do" or "the European Union takes advantage of us" during his presidency, was precisely calling for a fairer order in the automobile sector. The tariff showdown with Europe on this issue occupied the agenda for a while. At the time, Germany's threat to impose restrictions on car exports was on the table, but no clear result was achieved. Now, the fact that the German government is almost treating gasoline and diesel vehicles as obsolete technology under the Environmental Transformation Program is causing panic among US manufacturers. This is because many models exported to Europe by brands such as Ford and General Motors require significant R&D investments to meet the emission standards that the European Union will make mandatory in the coming years. If these investments are not made, vehicles coming from the US may not be authorized for sale in Germany and similar countries. On the French front, the prioritized French industry approach is gaining strength. This may mean that brands such as Peugeot, Citroën, and Renault will receive more incentives through state-sponsored policies or even a Europe-wide protection umbrella. US automakers, on the other hand, fear new regulatory hurdles or additional taxes in France. The Paris government has set ambitious targets for electric vehicle conversion and, with the support of the European Commission, could soon enact laws that would further weaken the hand of internal combustion engine vehicles. This could make SUVs and pickups from the United States with large gasoline engines virtually uncompetitive. As a result, the US automotive industry is being paralyzed is not an exaggeration, but a threat that is becoming more and more real. Denmark's name may not be heard as often as Germany and France, but it stands out for its tough policies on green energy and sustainability. The Copenhagen government has plans to reduce carbon emissions in the automobile sector to almost zero. The country is considering banning vehicles with internal combustion engines after certain dates or raising their prices with disincentive taxes. Moreover, Denmark is lobbying for similar policies within the EU. This will pose a challenge not only for vehicles from the US, but also for traditional automakers in many EU member states. However, since American cars are already known for their high-volume engine, high-fuel consumption image, they will not be able to survive in countries like Denmark that have adopted tough environmental policies. In Europe, American electric vehicle brands such as Tesla seem to have an advantage, but the overall picture puts the large American industry, which produces vehicles with high carbon emissions, in a corner. At this point, the phrase $1.5 trillion US automotive industry reminds us that this sector is not only a matter of profit and loss, but also a gigantic ecosystem. The automotive supply chain encompasses millions of workers, from the steel and metal industry to autonomous software companies, parts manufacturers, and fuel companies. In the US, the sector has been providing steady employment for decades and generating federal and state tax revenues from exports. Now, restrictions imposed by European countries such as Germany, France, and Denmark in the name of the Green Revolution, or in the name of protecting their own industries, are causing American manufacturers to cry out, "We can't lose the export market so easily." While some companies are looking to China or South America, Europe's geopolitical importance and high purchasing power are not easy to give up. US automakers may be lobbying for at least a reasonable transition period, or European standards should not be introduced so quickly. However, as European public opinion is becoming increasingly aware of climate change and environmental awareness, the chances of such lobbying efforts succeeding seem low. On the Trump front, there are several reasons why these developments are surprising. First, the Trump administration believed that it would gain a number of advantages in favor of the US in trade relations with Europe. For example, it thought that it could force Europe to open the door to American products by exerting pressure on NATO defense spending, and even targeted the foreign trade surpluses of countries like Germany with threatening statements from time to time. However, the Europeans seem to have said, "The automotive sector is the heart of our economy, and we will protect our own interests," and launched a series of attacks. Second, There was an expectation in Trump circles that the US oil and gas sector would sell more LNG to Europe so that high-powered vehicles could remain on the market there. But this calculation did not work out when Europe chose to cut its carbon footprint. Third, since the green energy revolution led by Denmark is a transformation that has not yet been fully realized in the US, the opposite happened. Current news sources have not been able to clarify whether Germany, France, and Denmark have developed a joint European initiative, or whether they coincidentally intersected, each country enacting its own national plans at the same time. Nevertheless, it is clear that a group of countries, the so-called Green Bloc, are in a race to make the internal combustion engine a thing of the past. The EU Commission is discussing numerous regulations aimed at achieving zero-emission vehicles by 2035. While European automakers are trying to prepare for this transformation, US companies are lagging behind. This is not just about tariffs, but also about the weaponization of standards and norms. For a car to enter the European market, it has to pass environmental and safety tests and fall below a certain carbon dioxide emission value. To achieve this, American manufacturers will either produce special models for Europe with expensive R&D processes or risk withdrawing from that market. Thus, the US automotive industry, which is called the world leader, is faced with a major dilemma in the face of Europe. This situation is also expected to have repercussions on US domestic politics. As he did during his presidency, Trump may make statements such as, "Europe is deceiving us. They are not being fair in our trade." There will certainly be supporters of this rhetoric in his own party base. But Europe's argument could be, "We are only implementing policies that protect the climate and the environment. We are not deliberately excluding anyone." As the Danish example shows, even European car manufacturers may be challenged by these strict environmental rules. However, European countries are convinced that this transformation will bring economic and social benefits in the long run. Therefore, they are not likely to back down. It would be too simplistic to reduce the issue to US cars should be taxed more, European cars should be protected. At the heart of the matter is the fight against the climate crisis, Europe's carbon-neutral goals, and the effort to prepare its industry for the future. We are not ready for such a rapid leap. Europe is taking advantage of the situation and opening up space for its own brands, American automobile manufacturers complain. Of course, a complete shutdown or paralysis of the $1.5 trillion US automotive industry is not a scenario that will happen tomorrow. But these developments signal that the big manufacturers may not be able to compete in Europe in the future, and that their export figures may even erode. If market share falls by 50–60% in the long term, American companies may face the possibility of closure or merger. Numerous suppliers and subcontractors of automotive components would also be affected. Some analysts argue that the US could counter this by accelerating its own green transformation. In other words, other manufacturers should join the momentum gained by electric vehicle brands such as Tesla, quickly abandoning internal combustion engines and producing electric and hybrid models suitable for the European market. But this requires a major change in mindset and infrastructure. If American companies, which have long relied on traditional engine and transmission production, are slow to adapt to this transformation, the door to Europe may indeed close for them. In fact, similarly stringent rules are on the agenda not only in Europe, but also in other giant markets such as China and Japan. Beyond that, Trump's bewilderment also points to a diplomatic dimension. While the US expects more support or military spending from Europe on issues such as NATO, Europe is going its own way, with policies that protect its own industry. This can be read as an indication of a rift in transatlantic relations. Although both sides claim to be strategic partners, economic conflicts of interest, environmental regulations, and technology competition sometimes put a strain on this partnership. Moreover, Germany and France, as the driving forces of the European Union, have the power to enforce their policies across the EU. Denmark, on the other hand, is a small but determined actor and the voice of European environmentalists. If the US underestimates the pressure coming from here, its companies could lose the European market altogether. No one can say for sure how this picture will evolve in the long run. If Europe's policies in favor of green and domestic cars work, European brands could soon become world leaders in electric and sustainable models. If America sticks to its big car tradition, it will lose markets. But at the same time, stricter emission standards may gradually be introduced in the American domestic market. After all, the climate crisis is a global reality, and many cities in the US are now demanding new rules to protect the environment. If such a transformation is inevitable, America's giant automotive companies could become too late and suffer huge financial losses. But on the other hand, since the US is strong in the entrepreneurial ecosystem and high-tech sector, there is a chance to make a different leap in future electric or autonomous vehicles. So it is premature to say that they definitely lost. Nevertheless, the current steps taken by Germany, France, and Denmark have largely put American manufacturers on the defensive. It remains to be seen how Trump will react to this development. He may take steps such as imposing new tariffs on Europe or taxing EU-origin vehicles in the automotive sector. However, if this turns into a trade war, it could harm both sides. German cars also have a significant share of the US market. If the US and Europe start a chain of retaliations, problems such as global economic stagnation and unemployment could increase. As economies are still recovering from the pandemic, such a large-scale trade spat would have unintended consequences. Denmark or France may be more cautious in the face of a harsh economic backlash from the United States, but it is unlikely to throw away its environmental protection goals. Moreover, the EU bureaucracy does not easily cancel such legislation. On the contrary, it continues it. At the moment, the picture is clear. Germany, France, and Denmark are directly or indirectly making it more difficult for the US to export automobiles. And this is not just a simple customs issue, but a broad strategy that includes technology, environment, and cost parameters. The US automotive industry is already wailing that we are about to be paralyzed. Trump is surprised because he did not expect such a swift and coordinated European attack. Some argue that this is a declaration of European independence. In recent years, the European Union has been taking steps to consolidate its global power. It is trying not to succumb to US impositions in areas such as energy, technology, defense, and now automotive. The United States, on the other hand, has been complaining that you are imposing such strict environmental standards, in effect creating a huge trade barrier. It is not clear whether this confrontation will escalate in the near future or whether a bargaining table will be set up and a common formula developed. But manufacturers cannot decide today and change production tomorrow. They have long planning processes. This is why US producers have hit the emergency alarm button. Options such as adapting to European emission limits or partially moving production to Europe require billions of dollars of investment. This is why the impact of Germany, France, and Denmark's moves cannot be underestimated. While paving the way for the EU's broader environmental protection plans, these three countries strengthen the expectation that the US automotive industry will not be able to export as easily as before. Trump's bewilderment may be a political mise-en-scène, but the panic in the American business world appears to be real. Although the automotive industry is prone to technological transformation, it is a costly and time-consuming process for companies that have made profits by producing huge vehicles with high fuel consumption for many years to suddenly switch to environmentally friendly electric models. If the European market closes the door to competition in this process, US manufacturers could suffer big losses. German brands such as Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes, and French giants such as Peugeot or Renault can rapidly advance in the next generation of clean vehicles with the support of the European Union. If the US market is caught unprepared for this transformation, it will fall into a huge gap both in the domestic market and in exports. When we summarize this picture, it is clear that although the title, the $1.5 trillion US automotive industry paralyzed, may seem like an exaggerated statement, it is not baseless. The process is not happening all of a sudden, but the way things are going, it is almost certain that the US automotive industry will bleed in Europe and fall behind in the long run if it does not make strategic moves. Trump's surprise depends on the speed and scale of these developments. After all, Trump expected Europe to bend to his every whim, but on the contrary, he was confronted with a strong environmentalist and protectionist bloc. The attacks of Germany, France, and Denmark could turn into a more effective wall with the addition of other EU countries. This scenario confirms that the US automotive giants are entering a challenging period. So what does the future hold? One possibility is that the US and the EU could start negotiating a new trade agreement. US manufacturers might agree to make concessions on emissions and environmental issues and move to produce models more suitable for Europe. In return, Europe could avoid a major trade war by providing some customs or administrative relief. but this would require a highly complex diplomatic process. Its duration is uncertain. Another possibility is that the American automotive industry would focus on the domestic market and Asia, leaving Europe behind. But this would force US companies to downsize in the face of global competition. Time will therefore tell which path will be chosen. For now, what is known is that the steps taken by Germany, France, and Denmark have resonated widely in American politics and business, including with Trump. As the face of Europe changes, the US auto industry is likely to face a prolonged adjustment crisis. We'll have to wait and see how this plays out. What do you think? Are Europe's green moves really strong enough to paralyze the US auto industry, or will the American giants somehow manage to adapt and remain competitive? Is Trump's surprise a foreign policy tactic, or did they really face an unexpected defeat? You can deepen the discussion by sharing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and support us by liking this podcast. We will continue to share new insights on industry transformations and international trade wars as they become available. For now, thank you for listening, take care, and we'll see you next time.